Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of JS Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Jesu meine Freude. But again, this is the third out of 3 parts in our look at the Jesu meine Freude motet. All of the chorales use the same text and the same melodic material. Each setting is slightly different in terms of its texture, and there are slight harmonic variations, but typically the same harmonic patterns and progressions have occurred throughout. So if you've watched yesterday's episode, if you watched the episode from 2 days ago, you'll already be familiar with this chorale as far as what's happening, generally speaking. However, we're going to analyze this chorale regardless because it does have a unique profile. It is highly contrapuntal. So we're going to have to, take some chords with a grain of salt because we pretty much have the same contrapuntal density that we usually have in a cadence throughout the entirety of the chorale. This chorale kind of pushes the boundaries in terms of what I would consider a chorale. I'd say this is about as extreme texturally as I would expect a chorale to be. It was definitely kind of a head scratcher because, yes, it is a melody. It has a melody very similar to how a chorale would have a melody as far as the pacing is concerned, but the supporting voices, the lower 3 voices, they're so active that sometimes it's hard to establish a uniform harmonic rhythm. But with that being said, I think there is a general quarter note pulse going on here where the chords are being introduced, and that's the general grid we're going to be following. So hopping into the analysis, 1 sharp in the key signature, we start on E minor, we end on E major. I reckon we're in the key of E minor. We then move to E minor in first inversion, G, E, B, and B. We'll just change the figured bass, and we get E, B, and G on the next 8th note, which just returns us back to root position. So we'll just adjust with the figured bass. We then have C, E, G, and A, which is A minor 7 over C. This analysis is kind of, depending on how granular you want to be, I'm going to say that this is a 4-6-5-2 with D sharp and F sharp being introduced, with the C also being cut out of the bass. That is a 7 chord, D sharp diminished. The tenor actually becomes the lower of the voices here, so that's something to bear in mind. Or you could just say that this is a 7-6 chord, and this E and this G are both accented non-chord tones. Either way, it depends on how, like I said, granular or subatomic you want to get with your analysis here. I'm being, I think, just about as thorough as I need to be. When I see a 4, if there's a 7 in passing, especially if there is a tonic on the other side, I tend to pay mind to both the 7 and the 4. Sometimes the 4 isn't there, or the 4 isn't entirely intact. Sometimes the 7's not entirely intact, but here we are seeing both of them intact. I feel like it's worth noting. Here we have E, F sharp, and E. This F sharp is an accented non-chord tone. I think this is actually B, G, E, and G. We can call this a 1 chord or a 1-6-4 chord. We could even go as far to call this a 6 chord, because if we see this E and G, with this C still being the last thing we heard in the bass, this could be a deceptive progression of sorts, especially because of the fact that we are going to A, C, E, and F sharp, which is 2-6-5, F sharp minor 7 flat 5, and 6 going to 2 would be the normative progression. 1-6-4 to 2 would definitely be an unusual progression, but we have seen that recently actually, where 2 was an interrupting chord between 1-6-4 and 5. So yeah, I guess that's kind of what's happening here, but because there are no cadences in this chorale due to, I imagine, just the highly contrapuntal nature, we only really get the cadences at the end. There's still the general cadential patterns that we saw, and I'll show them, or that we've seen in previous versions of this similar chorale, and I'll mark them with parentheses. The first one is coming right up. It's right here over this E, or under this E, I suppose, because that's the uppermost voice. But after our 2-6-5 chord, let's get all of our non-chord tones out of the way. This D sharp's a non-chord tone. This C sharp's also a non-chord tone because C natural is the chord tone here, so there's some interesting cross relations here. This B is a non-chord tone. Both this F sharp and this A are chord tones. We then have B, B, D sharp, and F, which is our 5 chord, B major. This A is a passing 7th. This B is a chord tone. Bass just leaps down an octave. Bach does it all the time. And then we have E, G, E, and E, which is our tonic triad, E minor, and root position. The cadence then continues on. We don't really get a loss of momentum here. Neighbor tones in the inner voices, this G and this E are they're chord tones, and we have some more non-chord tones that are passing tones, leading us into the next phrase. If you know the progression from yesterday's chorale or the chorale before, you know that we're modulating to the key of D major here, as we can see in the melody. There's either some E Dorian shenanigans going on here with the raised 6th and the natural 7th, or we're in the key of D major, but it sounds a little bit more D major-like to me. This E minor that we get here, E, G, and B, is both a 1 chord in the key of E minor and a 2 chord in the key of D major. This F sharp is a very brief passing tone. We have chord tones. Oh, I keep on saying non-chord tones. It's the literal opposite of what I'm trying to say. We have chord tones on beat 1 and before we go to A, C sharp. Really the texture thins out here, but really what's being implied is some type of 5 chord, A major, with a passing 7th here. This E is a non-chord tone. I did it again, oh my goodness, this E is a chord tone. E is very much a chord tone in an A major chord. And then we have F sharp, A, and D, which is our tonic triad in first inversion D major. That gets turned into root position on the and of the same beat, D, F sharp, A, and D. We then go to G major, G, D, A, and B, but by the time we get the G introduced, we also get some A action going on as well. So the counterpoint, we know that a 4 chord is being implied here, but sometimes the counterpoint throws us for a loop. This F sharp is also a neighboring 7th, very brief, but a neighboring 7th regardless. And I think this 4 chord is where we go back to the key of E minor as we're closing in on a half cadence in the key of E minor, even though the momentum doesn't stop at the fermata because there is no fermata. So this 4 chord is now 3 in the key of E minor. We then get G, B, G, and E, which is E minor in first inversion. Another 3-to-1 progression like we had in yesterday's chorale. In the chorale before that, it's very interesting, a very stable progression. The chords are very similar to one another. G and E minor share 2 tones out of their 3 tones in common, so not much to introduce to the texture over this progression. It's almost like a static progression, if that makes sense. This F sharp is a non-chord tone, this E is a chord tone, this A is a non-chord tone, this A is also a non-chord tone, and very, very briefly we get root position here, E, G, B, and E on the 16th note before we get C, E, A, and E. This is A minor in first inversion, 4-6. This D sharp is a neighbor tone, and then we get this E again, which is a chord tone before we cadence on D major. B major, not D major, sorry. B, F sharp, B, and D sharp, 5 chord. More specifically, this is a Phrygian half cadence. That's been the same type of half cadence over the last 2 chorales as well. And as we're into the end of our A section, we have a bit of a perfect, I'm calling it a perfect authentic cadence, but some people might call it a plagal cadence, depending on where the cadence starts for you, and we could talk about it when we get there. But moving ahead, this again, we continue the momentum here, but the bass is the voice that gets the activity rather than the inner voices. Neighbor tone here, B is still a chord tone, A is a passing 7th, and then we get G, B, and E. It's E minor in first inversion. Passing tone in the bass. This D sharp is a non-chord tone, this A is a non-chord tone, this F sharp is a non-chord tone. When we see 4 voices moving on the offbeat, we know that there is usually a subdivision of the harmonic rhythm going on here. This is D sharp diminished over F sharp, which is 7-6, before we go to E minor, E, E, G, and G. An interesting 2-root 2/3 spelling here. 1-6-7-6-1 is a very normal progression in Bach. Then we also get the chord that turns into first inversion. We have G, E, B, and G. It's just E minor over G. We don't have to mark any non-chord tones or anything. We'll just change the figured bass. And then we have A, E, C, and F sharp. That's another F sharp minor 7 flat 5. 2-6-5. Very normal to start the cadence off on. This is why I think the cadence starts here rather than on the E. This feels more like a coda to me, or I guess it's not a fully blown coda. It's more like a codetta, like a coda junior. But this F sharp, this E, this A, and this F sharp kind of turns the chord into root position, but again, we lose that diminished fifth. That really gives the minor 7 flat 5 chord its a flat 5. Otherwise, we don't know if it's a minor chord or a diminished chord as its foundation. I think with an educated, guess, seeing that it was a diminished chord before that, we could infer that even without the diminished fifth, it's still diminished as far as its identity is concerned. But as far as the analysis goes, I don't think it's super important in this case, and it doesn't seem worthwhile to mark it as I have been the chords that come intact on the offbeat. Then we get, after our F sharp minor 7 flat 5, we get B, D sharp, F sharp, and F sharp, which is B major in root position, our 5 chord, passing 7th in the bass, a repeated tone in the melody before we get E major, G sharp, B, B, and E, which is our tonic triad, and a major quality tonic triad in first inversion. It turns into root position on the and. Again, Bach has sort of turned this into a motive, 1 turning into 1-6, 1-6 turning into 1, 1-6 turning into 1, just the 1-6 turning into 1, just lots of tonic triads that are then followed by a skip in the bass, and the chord is seen intact, and this D is also a suspension. We then have A, C, E, and E, which is a minor 4 chord, A minor more specifically, our subdominant, little brief neighbor tone going on here before we get the same tones on the end of the beat, and then we get E major proper, E, B, G sharp, and E, our tonic triad here. So this is where the plagal cadence comes from, 1-6-4-1. If that's how you feel the cadence operates, that's totally fine. To me, 2-6-5-5-1 is what the cadence really feels like. So I'm going to call this a perfect authentic cadence. But plagal cadence is totally valid too. It just depends on where you see the cadence happening. So going into the B section, we know from yesterday that we're looking to modulate to the key of G major. This progression is slightly different. We go from E major to E minor, E, E, G, and B. So we'll just actually rewrite the Roman numeral here. We won't try and mess around with figured bass. We have D sharp here, which is a non-chord tone, F sharp, and A, all non-chord tones with this B in the melody. This spells B7 over D sharp, which is 5-6-5. We get that same chord going on the beat too, so there's like a harmonic rhythm syncopation going on here where a new chord's being introduced on beat 1 and on beat 2 and, rather than on beat 1 and 2. We then have E, which is a non-chord tone, E, which is a non-chord tone, G, which is a non-chord tone that is our tonic triad in root position, E minor, and then afterwards we get the C in the melody, which changes E minor to C major in first inversion, E, E, G, and C, which in the key of E minor is 6-6, but in the key of G major it's 4-6. So we can say that the modulation really happens at any point, like, from this E minor chord here, but this C major really felt like the turning point for me because it's followed by D natural. We have this interesting chromatic imitation going on in the bass and the tenor. The bass does E, D sharp, E. The tenor does E, D, D, E. So it's some interesting cross relations here where the tenor is introducing G and the bass is staying strong on E minor. But after our 4-6 chord, we get F sharp, which is a non-chord tone, D, which is a non-chord tone, A, which is a non-chord tone, that is, and with the C in the melody, that is again 5-6-5, D7 over F sharp before we go to G major, G, D, A, and B. So we know that a tonic triad's being implied, but also we get a hint of deception here because when the A resolves, we get E in the bass and the tenor, which introduces 6. One might even go as far to say as the 1 chord never really happens, it's always a 6, because the 6 is the only chord on this beat that gets introduced entirely intact, whereas the G chord is subverted because of this A right here. regardless, I'm going to stick to my analysis and my notes because this A does feel like kind of like a suspension figure, or at least an accented non-chord tone. But as we're closing in on our faux cadence here, perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, we have some interesting chromaticism here in the bass: C, C sharp, and D. C, E, G, and A spells A minor 7 over C, which is 2, 6, 5. The C sharp here does in fact change the chord to A7 over C sharp, which changes its function to secondary dominant, 5, 6, 5 of 5, because A is the dominant of D, and then we get D afterwards, D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our 5 chord, with this little anticipation of A7 going on here in the tenor. And then we cadence on G major, G, C, G, and G. Again, kind of doing the same thing that we had here. We know the 1 chord's being implied. It's also over a 1 chord, which is an interesting coincidence. Maybe it's not a coincidence, but this A is functioning like a suspension, and really it does feel like a 1 chord's being resolved too. So even though there is a suspension going on, we get proper context afterwards. So the B and the D are chord tones, the C is a non-chord tone, the E is a non-chord tone, the F sharp is a non-chord tone, the A is a non-chord tone. Now in the same fashion that we had our second phrase modulate to the key of D major, we're also looking to modulate to the key of D major here. We have another G major chord, G, G, and B, which in the key of D major is our 4 chord. Then we get G, B, and D, which is, still a 4 chord, no need to mark it. And then we have E, G, and C sharp with this G in the bass, but we also have an A introduced as well. So I guess technically speaking, this is a 7/6 chord of sorts, but I think 5/4/2, or sorry, it should be 7/6/4, I guess, because the G is in the bass, but 5/4/2 could also be an accurate analysis, I think, depending on how you hear this. But ultimately, what matters is that you hear the fact that there is a dominant functioning chord happening here before we get D major, F sharp, A, G. It's interesting staccato marking that made it into the edit. Apologies about that. D. But with the counterpoint going on, we know that 1/6 is being implied here. The D gets introduced here where we have G, A, and D at the same time. So this G is like an inverted suspension. We expect it to resolve down, but here we have it resolving up by step. I feel like there's a word for that, but I can't recall what it is. I probably knew it at some point, but regardless, we know this G is the non-chord tone here. This F sharp's a chord tone. This G is a non-chord tone. This A is a chord tone. Even for a brief moment, we do have a root position 5 chord going on here with the D, F sharp, A, and D before we go to G major, just like how we did in this section right here. Even with this suspended A going on, G, D, A, and B, the G gets resolved to. By the time the G gets introduced, the F sharp, the passing or the neighboring 7th, is already happening in the bass, but we know that a 4 chord is being implied. Again, with counterpoint, you have to be a little bit more liberal with your analysis. You know that chords are being implied, but when melodies are disagreeing with one another and harmony is being implied, that's exactly how you need to analyze it, as harmony that's being implied without stretching the truth too much, too thinly. Clearly we're going to 4 here. That's the progression that's also been used over the last couple of settings we've looked at as we've modulated over a 4 chord. But as you probably already know if you've seen yesterday's episode or the day before, in this case we actually modulate to the key of B minor. So instead of this turning into 3 like it did here, it's turning into 6. We then get G sharp, D, E, and E. That's like an E7 chord over G sharp, which would not be a secondary dominant, not like 5 of 7, but rather harmonization of the melodic minor scale, because we very clearly have melodic minor in the bass here. This is a 4/6/5 chord. Passing tone, neighbor tone. This G is actually a chord. No, this is a G natural, so this is also a non-chord tone, just like how this C sharp, where's the C sharp? I'm not crazy, I know I saw it. This C sharp right here is also a non-chord tone in the same way. But here we have A sharp, C sharp, G, and E, which is like a passing 7 chord, fully diminished, A sharp, fully diminished, which is our leading tone chord in the key of B minor. And of course we get B minor afterwards, B, D, F sharp, and D, our tonic triad. This G is a non-chord tone, again with this idea of taking the tonic triad and skipping down afterwards, but with a root position triad, it doesn't invert the chord, it changes its structure. We get E going on here, which is a non-chord tone. This B is a chord tone, we get D. It's kind of like a E minor 7, like a 4-6-5 chord going on here, actually, in all of this. Very brief, but actually it's not even super brief. I mean, this B minor chord is just as brief. But after this 4-6-5 chord, whether or not you feel like that's necessary, I don't know. The chord is definitely there, though. We can then get, or we can look at E, G, B, and C sharp, which is C sharp minor 7 flat 5, which is 2-6-5. Bach loves 2-6-5 chords. Chromatic passing tone in the bass. This we have E sharp, C, B, E sharp, C sharp, B, and C sharp, which is like a C sharp 7 chord over E, and similarly to how our G major cadence had a 5-6-5 of 5, we too have 5-6-5 of 5, because C sharp is the dominant of F sharp, which is our 5 chord, and then we get F sharp afterwards. F sharp, A sharp, and C sharp are 5 chords. So there is symmetry between these two phrases, as well as symmetry between these two phrases. Bach took the modulation scheme and varied it for the 4th phrase, or I guess the 5th phrase actually, and also borrowed the cadential pattern from the 4th phrase as well. So we see symmetry in 2 different ways here. This E is a passing 7th before we get B, D sharp, B, and B, similar to how we ended the A section in this case, which Bach did not do in yesterday's chorale. He ended on a minor chord. We're ending on a major chord here. And when we see a cadence in the key of the minor dominant, and the minor dominant is cadenced as a major quality triad, we typically see it recontextualized as the dominant in the key of the tonic minor. I guess more simply said, if we see B major, a cadence with B major, and it's not a half cadence, it's typically going to quickly reverse course and turn into E minor, where it is our 5 chord and just naturally allied with the key of E minor. So B is a chord tone, F sharp is a chord tone, B is a chord tone, A is a passing 7th, B is a chord tone. We then have E, G, and B, which is a tonic triad. We even get another E here in the bass. That's our 1 chord. The key of E minor. This D is a neighbor tone. Then we have G, E, G, and B, which is just taking our tonic triad again and putting it in first inversion, so we'll just change the figured bass. And then when the E gets introduced, it's kind of like taking the chord, putting it in root position again, just drawing comparisons between, the first time we see the pattern and every subsequent time we see it later on. We then have C, E, G, and A, which is A minor 7 over C. Again, we see a very similar pattern to the first phrase here. This is 4-6-5. And then when the D sharp and the F sharp gets introduced, it turns it into D sharp diminished, which is just a 7 chord. And by the time we get this F sharp here, it's like we have a 1-6-4 chord, because we have B, G, E, and G. So this 1-6-4 chord feels largely contrapuntal. It really, whether you look at it as an E minor chord, because the E is the voice that we hear when the chord, or at least this interval, gets introduced here, that introduces the idea of the chord. By the time it gets fully contextualized, I feel like 1-6-4 would be a little bit more accurate of an analysis, but either way it's splitting hairs. 6 of one, half dozen another, as I have said in past videos as well. We then have A, C, E, and F sharp. It's F sharp minor 7 flat 5. Bach loves 2-6-5 chords. We have this D natural here as well, which is interesting, with a neighbor tone as well. The C sharp, same thing here. It's a non-chord tone. I had to look into my notes and see whether or not this was D sharp, because we have a D natural here as well. And unlike the ending of the A section where we had D sharp in the tenor, we have D sharp in the tenor here, but in the alto we have D natural. Bach avoids D in the alto here, but when we get it introduced, instead of getting B major, we get B minor, which gives us a very old world early music sound, where we have a minor 5 chord going to a major tonic. It's very interesting. We have a passing 7th in the bass as well. This B natural is also a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. But here we have 1, 6, 4, or sorry, not 1, 6, 4, what am I doing? 1, 6, very similar to how we ended our first section. So this has very balanced binary vibes where we have material, first cadence, material, first cadence varied. Somehow, at least from a harmonic standpoint, there are formal similarities, but maybe there's not enough from the rest of the chorale standpoint to justify that. But I don't know, just based on my experience. But this D, again, is suspended, this time in the alto rather than in the tenor. This E, G sharp, E, and B is like taking the chord, putting it in root position. One might even argue it's in root position from the start because the D undermines the analysis a bit, but I don't know, 1, 6 going to 5, 1 in root position has been a common motive, so I'm going to stay consistent with it. This D is still a non-chord tone. We then get A, E, C, and E. Root position 4 chord, A minor, very similar to our cadence at the end of the A section. This B is a non-chord tone. A, C, and E, another 4 chord, no need to reanalyze. That's also happening on an off beat, so we wouldn't reanalyze anyways. And then we have E, A. This A is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. This G sharp is actually our chord tone. Then B and E, which just reiterates our tonic triad. So this is really our only cadence that's marked by fermatas, even though it's staggered and definitely unusual. Some type of authentic or plagal cadence, depending on how you look at it. I'm going to stick with the perfect authentic cadence and just call this little bit of codetta, but it's entirely up to you whether or not you decide the cadence is from 4 to 1, because that's where the fermatas occur, or if it's 2, 6, 5, 1. Actually, I might walk that back a bit. We don't have a leading tone going on, so maybe it's some type of modified authentic cadence because we have 5 going to 1, but no D sharp, and I wonder if that's a printing error in the score that I'm looking at, or if that's actually the case. I might need to listen to an actual recording of this particular chorale again and listen to that more intuitive or more intently now that I know. But that is something that I'll make it into the description if that is something I need to change. But regardless, that's going to wrap up tonight's analysis. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate all the support. We recently broke 100 subscribers. Super exciting. I can't tell you how thrilled I am that this channel is actually growing. When I first started the channel, I was like, oh, maybe people will enjoy some of the videos. I don't know. I'm not really going to push the envelope or try to play the YouTube algorithm or anything like that, because this is a hobby and that's how I want it to stay. But 100 subscribers, I kind of feel like a big deal. But regardless, before my my head just fills with hot air and I just ascend into the sky, not really too much to say about this chorale. I already commented at length about how contrapuntal it was and how that changes my frame of mind as far as the analysis is concerned, or really how it, I would imagine, changes anyone's frame of mind, because you have to be a little bit more creative and think more outside of the box as far as where you derive some of these chords, and you're bound to bump into a ton of non-chord tones because of the contrapuntal nature. But other than that, we know this chord progression very well. We know this modulatory or key mapping very well, and I think that's going to be the last that I say about this particular chorale. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe. Feel free to click the notification icon so you can be notified of when my daily upload goes live. If you want to get your daily dose of Bach or your daily fix of analysis, this is the place to get it. But with all that being said, again, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.